Well, thanks to everyone for coming along tonight here at the Corby Irish Centre, and welcome to the Free Exchange, which, for those who don't know, is a programme of informal discussions in which we put artists and experts with common areas of experience with one another and with an audience. This month, the chosen subject is art, football and fans, with a particular focus on the politics of identity. We've invited two speakers with practices and personal experience particularly relevant to this topic, Roderick Buchanan and Dr. Jon Blackwood. Roddy is an artist based in Glasgow who is interested in sports, games and recreational activities and how they can express and communicate issues of race, nationality, aspiration, culture and identity. Roddy is also currently working with Celtic and Rangers fans based in Corby to produce a new film. Dr. Jon Blackwood is a writer and lecturer at Grey School of Art, Robert Gordon University, Aberdeen. He's interested in contemporary art, politics and national identity. He's now based in the northeast of Scotland and continues to divide his time between Scotland and the former Yugoslavia, I believe. Okay. Roddy, I'd like to invite you to kick us off tonight by asking you about your practice in relation to our subject topic this evening. So if you could just tell us a bit about that.
Well, I suppose I'm down here working very specifically to within the Scottish community who came down in the 30s, 40s, 50s to work in the steel, and who are now still round and about and watching Rangers and Celtic sort of specifically. They're the clubs that I'm trying to catch up with, or the fan groups that I'm sort of making contact with. So it's been an exercise in kind of engagement and trying to get into people's company, and in sort of formal terms, you know, set about taking photographs to start with. You know, how do you get somebody's photograph, or how do you ask, how do you make that happen? So to an extent, that's where I am at the moment inside the project, just building up relationships and working with them. I'm not particularly, street photography or that kind of style of photography isn't a sort of language that I've really used before. But I suppose my area of interest and what I've sort of focused on over the years is making way into communities that are perhaps not really so engaged in the visual arts or in going to museum shows or art exhibitions, and sort of, I guess, bridging to that community, and then also being I suppose a conduit to kind of open up a discussion around assumptions about how that community work or operate and that sort of thing. So to an extent, James, who was specifically the kind of arts officer who invited me to come down, he's from Corby and was brought up in amongst a kind of Scottish community. And it was funny when the discussion started, we were thinking a lot of the stories about Rangers and Celtic specifically were almost kind of legend, or perhaps even sort of apocryphal tales of where those communities hung out. It had been a very strong story, but it inevitably, as the Scottish community is getting older, because I'm not sure if there's that much traffic these days. I don't think there's new groups of Scots coming down particularly. The society is inevitably just getting old. There's less people out there. There's less kind of interest. A lot of their kids are identifying maybe as English. There is more interest in often there's kind of interest in Premiership clubs. There's all sort of financial and kind of structural reasons why that's very attractive, and particularly attractive to young people, and young people who didn't grow up in Glasgow. So that has actually been, I suppose the kind of greatest value I've found in terms of the undertaking is I think we should be able to, at the end of this project, have quite a nice document of effectively the last days of that community, you know, because on one of the afternoons when I went out to watch the Rangers game, the pub that James and other Rangers supporters who had spoken to all sent me up to the White Hart. You know, that was where the Rangers fans hang out. But on the day that I was there was tension in the bar, and effectively the barman said, "Isn't there a fucking Rangers bar anymore? This is a Liverpool bar now. You know, you can just fuck off if you want to watch the game. You know, we're watching the Liverpool game." You know, there you go. There's the remote. You can watch it in the wee telly over there. And so it was just these old men. You know, like you know, half a dozen of them. So it's quite poignant.
When you're talking about kind of the almost, I think you used the phrase, the old days or the ending of that.
Yeah.
I'm kind of quite interested. What was it that got you into kind of that combination of art and football?
Well, I suppose I have a very specific kind of interest. I was always, you know, it's a sort of visceral engagement with the material. I'm a footballer. I suppose that's you know, probably a bigger part of my identity than you know, being an artist. And as an artist, that's how I make my living. But I've always played football. I've always played football seriously. It's very much how I think about how the structure of how life works. You know, that's the you know, all situations can be resolved through a football metaphor. You know, I find it very useful in terms of how to you know, break down how the world works. And so I always was thinking in those terms. And it was only when I went to art school, I suppose, because of course I came from a family that had never had any experience in the arts. Nobody from my school had ever gone to art school. So the teachers I had actually were, they had done graphic design. So as pupils we were doing graphic design. There was no sort of talk of the fine arts or the idea of personal expression. It was all, the job was to, you know, was to do graphic illustration. That was going to be how I was going to earn my living. And it was only when I got to art school the possibility of you know, working as an artist, you know, was opened up to me. But I was a footballer and was trying to play football, you know, through that time. But there was very few other people who had that crossover. We've talked about it, John and I, quite a bit. You know, that there is James too. You know, it's not an easily intersecting community. There are other communities that exist within the arts that are you know, easy to pull out. For example, kind of artist guitar players. You know, there's tons of those. You know, they're thick on the ground. But artist footballers is an unusual you know, combination.
Yeah. And for you, John, what do you think are the links between contemporary art and football?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think initially the answer to that question is none, you know, because the two worlds are often seen as exclusive, and if not actively hostile to one another, then certainly indifferent to one another. But I think that's changed in the last 25 years or so. I remember with astonishment going to an exhibition at the Royal Academy in London in the late 1990s, and the exhibition was sponsored by Peterborough United. I actually thought it was a joke when I first saw it. There was Peterborough's badge, and this exhibition is sponsored by Peterborough. Like, what? Why are you doing that? I think it was around the time Barry Fry was the chairman and spending a lot of money and everything. But that was the first time I began to think, well, what is this relationship? Because I think if we all go back to childhood, we all go back to rather unsatisfactory attempts at fictionalising football. You know, I'm thinking the better books are by the likes of Brian Glanville, you know, Goalkeepers Are Different, or Michael Hardcastle's book for children were written in the 60s. But football requires a realism it becomes very tedious after a while to read about made-up teams and made-up players and made-up stadiums and fictional towns that somehow doesn't quite work. And I suppose there's a relationship there between that and what Marina Abramovich said about theatre and performance art. I mean, famously, she said that she hated theatre because it was full of lies, whereas performance art was actually real and in the moment and truthful. Now, you can really argue that point another time. But there is this interesting relationship there between fiction and truth in football. The other thing I'd like to pick up on about possible relations are the way football relates to space. If you think about the stereotypical footballer, you know, it's called Wayne, has a perm, has, you know, listens to, I don't know, Barry White on the car. That was a sort of stereotypical Brian McClare type interview and shoot in the 1980s. But actually that's a horrible stereotype because footballers aren't thick, they're just differently intelligent. If you look at the best footballers, Zidane, Ronaldo, Johan Cruyff in his day, they have Glenn Hoddle maybe, they have an unbelievable ability to read three-dimensional space and to anticipate what's going on around them and to read a game 2 or 3 or 4 moves ahead. In the same way as you can think of a painter organising compositional space or a sculptor being able to read some piece of stone and to find an image within it in the old-fashioned sense. So I think there's an interesting relationship there with space too, and there's an interesting relationship that Roddy and I have been talking a lot about, and Roddy's project here speaks a lot about, with social class. You know, I think in terms of the teaching of our art schools, particularly south of the border, where folk have now to pay a large sum of money every year to attend, the working classes are being squeezed out of that form of education. Roddy said to me earlier that he probably wouldn't go now if he was 18 and going to art school or facing the prospect of going to art school again. Maybe he wouldn't go if he was 18-year-old today. And that relates, I think, to an anxiety and debates about football, about the squeezing out of the working class fan base and supporter base. But you consider that you're now asked to front up 60, 70, 80 quid for a ticket to a Premier League game.
And that also applies to the working class are getting squeezed out of football altogether, as players as well, because it's now, you know, it's an increasingly middle class sport. You have to, certainly in my experience of, you know, I have 3 boys that have gone through youth football. If you don't have a car, you're done for. You can't take part in youth football anymore. So that's starters. When we first had our kids, we were living in the East End of Glasgow, and Dennis, in large, you know, working class neighbourhood, there was no provision for football. People were going out to the suburbs. So it's you know, to join teams in middle class neighbourhoods, partly because, of course, the amount of free support that is needed to run a football club. A lot of working men and women don't have the time to support that. Therefore, you know, there's nobody to run these clubs. So there is a gentrification of football, which is, you know, which has led to, of course, it's one of the reasons that Scotland is a football team in decline, and that it's you know, in other countries with less of that, you know, class story, it's growing. You know, for example, in Korea or whatever, it's you know, there isn't a middle class. There isn't an anxiety. There isn't the same anxiety around football in Korea as there is in the UK about, you know, what game you're allowed to play based on what your class background is.
From getting to know a very little bit about your practice, is it a case that was one of the most important things for you in terms of looking at football, was to capture something about class? I remember something that you said in one of your lectures, which was just about, there was a project where you'd captured, you'd gone and photographed young players for five-a-side teams,
Yeah.
and at the time they were wearing the Inter
Ah, yeah.
Milan and the
Yeah.
AC Milan shirts, and someone said to you, what was it? You did really well to get access to the
The Milan
to the
dressing
Milan
room,
dressing rooms,
yeah.
and you said they were just folks, just folks from the street. So I just wondered, what was it in your art that you're trying to capture in relation to football?
Well, I suppose in terms of if you roll that back to an extent in terms of general art practice that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Again, it's what John was saying about sincerity. There was a sort of recognition that after art school, where you were playing around with whatever language was coming to hand and giving it a go and seeing how that fitted and all that, then you were out and looking to develop a practice of your own. And amongst my friends, I recognised that we started to be working in subjects that we understood. It was and it was that kind of sincerity that felt right. There was a lot of work about heavy drinking, because there was a lot of people heavy drinking. A lot of people. Ross Sinclair was making a lot of work about rock music because he'd been in bands. That was Douglas Gordon made a lot of work about film and TV because he watched a lot of film and TV. I made work about football because that was a language I felt I understood and I felt I could work with, and that there was and so I've employed it over the years and applied it to a number of projects. Often it's again, it's about sincerity. It's never really a critique of football. It's I see it as being more direct than that. There's not. It's not so much a reflection on something. It kind of is what it is. And for example, the only way that I can take these photographs is to be sincere and in folks' company and to make that bridge. I'm not interested in taking fly photographs on the side, casually, having the camera and taking a wee photograph here and there. I have to directly speak to folk and tell them why I'm taking the photograph. And there is an exercise of catharsis there. It's definitely one of the reasons that I do these things. I've done a lot of that style of photography where the guys that were in the Milan strips and whatever, they were guys who were coming out from work and playing after work. And again, it was just, I suppose I had an interest in taking people's photographs, but how do you decide whose photograph to take? I set up a set of principles, which was anybody wearing that shirt that I saw, I would go and do it, and I'd ask them. Often when you're about to take a photograph, that moment's lost. You don't have the courage to take it, or you can't. You have the idea after. Oh, I wish I'd got that photograph or whatever. But set up a couple of guiding principles, and it means that's it. That relationship is there. It's in the street. I'm going to have that. I'm going to make that photograph. I'm going to try and make that happen. And it's about making that happen. And that's where the direct exchange is of value to me. And it's the same reward is happening in this project where you're genuinely trying to connect with people to take the photograph.
Okay. I'll just pick up on that comment about guiding principles. You're talking about them in relation to you as an artist.
Yeah.
Where do you think, because we're talking about art, football and fans, where do you think the commonality is for guiding principles in terms of maybe for fans in their identity? Because it's one of those things, isn't it? When we talk about football, it's unacceptable to change a club after a certain age. You change every other aspect of your life.
Even your marriage.
Absolutely. And in some cases, footballers several times. But the club that you support, you don't change that. So
well, that's interesting, because that leads us into territory of to go off on a slight tangent from your question, that leads us on to the territory of fan-owned clubs. And the only sort of way in which it is acceptable to change your club is if your club changes so much beyond recognition that you go off and form your own version of it. So the obvious example is FC United at Manchester, but there's also much closer to here, the FC Rushden and Diamonds, founded out the ashes of the the old Football League club, which is running exactly the same model, and AFC Wimbledon being the most successful example of these fan-run clubs. So there is a very interesting sort of set of identity questions posed by that circumstance. And famously, Sir Alex Ferguson hated FC United because he stuck to the old principle of that you articulated in your question. You stick with your club no matter what, and that's it. Regardless of decisions that are taken, you know, the club is still the same, regardless of what's happening in the boardroom.
I got it for Alex Ferguson.
Yeah.
When they had to give up, Rangers because they didn't accept his wife. So he left Rangers as a supporter and as a, he fell out of love with his club after being the top goal scorer for Rangers in that season that Celtic won the European Cup.
He was also blamed for Rangers losing a cup final quite unfairly just before he left and went to Dunfermline or Falkirk, I think was his next club. But that's a very interesting question you raise, because it is seen as a cardinal sin. You know, one year you follow Leicester, next year you're following, I don't know, Chelsea because they're more successful, and such folk are regarded with contempt by the old-fashioned football fan. But then again, we are entering a different era where people follow some types of fan rarely go to games. They watch on telly. And also there's the absolute advent in the last 20 years, because it's not even a new phenomenon, but it's definitely arrived where you follow a player. You're following a player. You're not. It doesn't matter what team they're playing for. You're following Neymar. You're interested in Neymar. That's who you're watching. You're going to see Neymar, or you're, that's who we're watching on the telly tonight. Actually, not even sure what club he's playing for, but you're just watching Neymar, and that's the identity of players has become so magnetic now. And that links in with branding.
Yeah.
There's the top footballers now are commercial brands and independent commercial entities, and there's a real debate at Premier League level as to who owns the image rights to particular footballers, and should we be charging the broadcasters an extra fee for using our image as part of their live broadcast.
Well, I remember specifically David Beckham and Roberto Carlos, agreed to swap shirts when they played because they were both Nike players. So they made that agreement that was the shot that had to be taken, was those two players, because they were both represented by the same company.
And do you think that dilutes, say, the fans' respect or loyalty for a club? Because I'm just wondering, what is this connection kind of between art and football? You use the word visceral, and in terms of kind of that identity with a club that you support, that seems a very apt word, but yet it's a word that's used quite often in the arts as well, isn't it? That visceral response to something. So it's just trying to, where are those links, or what is underpinning? Because I mean, inevitably, what John and I, were spent a happy hour last night of, talking it through, was how, of course, two people can look at the same thing and have entirely contrary, ideas about it, and that, in fact, of course, and it happens all the time, as you know yourself, a lot of the game is spent in a dispute with that guy who's sitting there, with that guy there. Are you really a fucking supporter of this team and all that crap? Get up and support your team, and there's a lot of dispute that's pretty disputatious, place, and that is obviously, so you're in love, but you're also out of love. People will think you're a real fan. Other people won't think you're a fan at all. How can you be a fan? How can this? There are many ways to support clubs, and everybody can find their way. That's
I think there's got to be the answer I would make to add to what Roddy's been saying is the idea of obsession, that you're obsessed with a particular entity to the extent that you're willing to go through a lot of quite poor experiences in order to maintain your relationship. If you follow a smaller team in particular, you have a lot of really bad Saturdays, either watching your side get thumped or watching a terrible quality goalless draw in the rain in an open terrace. I think there's an obsessiveness which links football and art, which takes us back to the actors as well. You'll hear many artists say, you know, I hate the work, 80% of the stuff I do I can't bear, but I don't know how to do anything else. You also hear footballers saying that a lot. If it wasn't for football, I don't know what I do. I'm really not built to do anything else.
I quite like the relentlessness, actually, seeing it with your own artwork as well. I quite like that, the idea that I'm into football. And I mean, it almost feels like football and art is sort of is the antithesis of art in a way, and I quite like that. People say to me, you know, oh, you're an artist, I can't believe you're into football and all that sort of thing. Yeah. But I quite like that. Yeah. So I've had the imaginary football league since I've been about 5 or 6, which has kind of gone off the radar now for the last 5 or 6 years. But I just quite like that obsessive, that continually writing the scores down. Yeah, I just think it's interesting, that kind of, you know, obsessive compulsive thing. There's definitely there definitely are parallels between the actual thing of being a fan. I mean, I went to see Liverpool about this time last year, and I'm from the Isle of Man originally, so there was never the opportunity to go and see to get to Liverpool that easily. So, you know, but going over there, I did sort of feel a bit like a fake fan, but I am a proper fan. I'm a Liverpool fan, you know. I was reading all the forums, like saying, you know, trying to work out what songs I'm going to sing, you know, and thinking, well, I don't really feel like one of the real deal, but I am the real deal. I think that may be where my imaginary football thing came from, and probably having that moat around me, being on this island. There wasn't that opportunity to go and see the big matches, so for me, I created that, my own sort of world. Potentially, that's probably one strand. It's that.
Yeah, I mean, there's people. For example, I'm drinking the beer now, but my whole relationship with football never involves drinking. I drink. It's not that I don't drink. I regularly drink, but I've never had that relationship with football. For many people, that is exclusively the project on the day. Or I've never been part of a supporters bus. I lived close to the stadium, so I walked to the game. I've never been on a supporters bus. For some people, that's really the major part of the experience, is being in that bus, being part of that crowd. So again, it's it's about your own relationship to your club, but that's what so it's a level of honesty that you have for yourself, with yourself, that means that you're allowed to call yourself a fan or whatever. It's not somebody else's judgment upon you.
I think does it feel like there's quite a bit of that though?
Definitely people will throw a punch if they think you're not the right thing. That's true, and that's rubbish too.
But do you think, because what I've been wondering, just listening, because I love football, I've been into it as long as I can remember, and worked for an arts organisation, so for me, the two are intertwined, but I'm wondering whether there's something in the sense of a shared experience that you might have when you watch a game, whether you're there or whether you're in the club or pub or wherever you are, because you do share the highs and lows of when your team scores, when the other team scores, the ref, if he does make something really stupid mistake, or if he cards someone when he should have or shouldn't have. You do share those reactions.
That sounds like the Venice Biennale.
but I'm just thinking, but with visual arts, isn't it more of a solo response? That it's all about the fact that we've been talking a lot about how the meaning of the work is created in the viewer's mind, and it's about their response to the work. And so it's a personal, individual relationship. There is a bit
of counter to that. Often at art school, boxing was the thing that historically always had the strong connection. It's the artist and the canvas. It's the boxer against the other boxer, and it's one-on-one. It's very. There's been a lot of books or people talking about that, and that football, because it's more of a collective activity, isn't trusted so much within the arts in the same way as even collaboration. Even Gilbert and George's, people are kind of, well, who really does make that work?
It's interesting, because I was trying to think before tonight's discussion of footballers who are also artists, and there's one the most famous in England is David James, the ex-England goalkeeper who makes not very good paintings, but he does.
Terrible.
He does. Yeah, there's one here of Bobby Moore being handed the World Cup by the Queen, and it's really bad.
It is.
You know, and unfortunately, there he is. There, you can pass that around if anyone's not seen it. But there is they're both.
We'll phone him up and see if he'll pass judgment. You taking a volley.
Quite right. It's probably slagging me on Twitter right now. But there is this lad too, Owen Vaughan Williams, who's sort of Wales' third choice keeper, plays for Inverness, and does.
He had a great European Championship.
Paintings based on his. He's from a slate mining town in North Wales, Welsh-speaking Wales, and he, there's a little bit of a couple of Welsh painters in there. So, and these are guys that it's interesting though, because goalkeepers are always the mavericks and the eccentrics and the individuals, famously. So it's quite interesting that they're associated with this solitary pursuit.
And they also tie in with drummers in a band as well.
Yeah.
Sit behind the.
And wicket keepers in cricket. Jack Russell, the former England wicket keeper, also does sort of very traditional paintings and does that full time now that he's retired.
I find it interesting. Someone said that the one thing that sets them apart is making art or enjoying art is a solo experience, because I know what you mean, but I think there's a Grayson Perry quote which he said, and he's wrong in some senses, but he said that art is a great pastime because you can enjoy it whilst you're having a drink and a chat with a mate. But obviously sport, and that includes football, is another good example, isn't it? So that kind of that shared experience. And
I've never played football with a drink and a chat with
I mean, like as a viewer.
Right, because I mean that is again, I suppose, a subdivision that is again could really be you could split the group into who is coming from as a player. It's a bit, I suppose I never had that engagement with. I never had that kind of obsessive relationship to a club. I suppose formed that relationship with the club out of having to have a club, because everybody has to have a club, So as and I was because I was playing a lot of football, I didn't see any other people, football on TV or anything like that. My relationship to all that is different. So there'll be some people who spent a lifetime following their club since they were a kid, and going to the stadium and all that. It's a different experience. It's a different whole subject.
And there is football, which is a collective art experience too. I mean, a colleague up in Aberdeen called Fraser MacDonald organised a performance called 24-Hour Football at Generator Projects in Dundee in 2011, which was a 5-a-side football game which lasted for 24 hours and involved lots of people involved in the Dundee art scene at the time, and some local footballers as well.
I came up from Glasgow and did a stint.
Were you in it?
I came up.
Yeah. So that's quite an interesting sort of football as performance as football. There was a really interesting set of relations in that project.
I saw some videos and some photos from that project, and the whole it was not a terribly big space, was it? And everything
quite small.
Was very kind of homemade.
Yeah.
No, it was a level of sincerity about it which I was a wee bit worried about. But when I get into the game, there was a genuine. Sometimes you get involved in a game, and again, that is an analysis. I play, I still play, and I also love campsite football during the summer. That's a big deal within the family, so I can play with my boys, and we take on other other folk, other locals and other families and that sort of thing. And it's a intergenerational, and all the dynamics of that are what's interesting. And I suppose sometimes you can go into games and there can be lots of things at play. For example, you could take on a group of guys who are maybe 15 or 16 and they don't like the idea of getting beat, by, you know, a 10-year-old, you know, a 14-year-old and a 50-year-old, and then they stop playing. They, you know, they deliberately don't, you know, see the game through because they want to destabilise the experience. I was a wee bit worried at Generator, you know, that there was going to be, it was going to be a bit of play acting around this game of football, but there was a genuine, you know, belief in seeing it through and seeing it through properly, and it was a, you know.
I think Fraser's work also is very much about the comedy side of football as well. He went through a series around that time, you probably saw it, of writing applications for everything. And Fraser's a Dundee fan, and Dundee's manager was sacked, and of course Fraser immediately applied for the job. You know, when a football manager is sacked at a professional club, there's always about 20 letters from roasters saying that they did really well in Championship Manager and can they have an interview, you know. And so Fraser got the standard, thanks your interest but no thanks, and then exhibited it as a work in the Generator Members show as part of his sort of applications. Work with applications, which is very interesting.
What we did, we did a similar show called Art Cup, where we, it was riffing off similar ideas, where we were, I had done a lot of shows, and a lot of shows connected with sport, and it was often slush funds attached to World Cups or European Championships. You know, you have to have your, you know, you've got to have your World Cup, you know, opera, and you've got to have your World Cup restaurant, and then you've got to have your World Cup contemporary art exhibition. And so I was doing that, and I did that for you know, years and years, and it would be a strange. I started to get a bit tired of it because you know, often it was people who had a critical view of the sport or the experience, but weren't doing it from the area that I was interested in. So I set up a project with Nuno Sacramento where we offered that, we invited people to apply to us to take part in an exhibition that was going to be 50% art, 50% football, and we did it first of all during the European Championship in 2004 in Portugal, and we took on a Portuguese group. And what was interesting about that, when it was the assessment of players, Glasgow had been quite well known for having a community that played football, you know, amongst the arts crowd. There was quite a lot of people who had come through the scene who played football. But what we were trying to do, and what Noonan and I were interested in, were people who were at a certain level. What you're talking about with David James would be maybe a case in point, where they were looking for a bit of balance in their life. They were looking to develop their football, and they were looking to develop their art career. They had to be working, you know, with both these things, and there had to be a certain balance. The assessment was a balance of that. About 50% we were looking at their football capacity, how they could work in constructing a team, and 50% how we were going to construct an exhibition about it. And for the purposes of this kind of discussion, it might be sort of instructive to say that one of the people that people were often interested when we suggested this idea was they knew that Dave Shrigley, for example, was very interested in football, played football with us, and very big within the kind of contemporary art scene as an artist. But he was the kind of, you know, was the wrong person for the project, because his football ability was really low, and you know, his ability in art was really high. So he was totally out of balance. So he couldn't take part in the experience because he couldn't work inside a football team. Because what we were looking for, what we were hoping for, was to be able to play a game of football, for example, in a pitch like Corby's Towns pitch, where you wouldn't notice that this was a group of artists. We were looking for people who had an ability level that allowed them to be playing as a team properly. So it was kind of interesting, and what that led to was a very interesting pool of artists, because we had to draw from a wide group, and when you exhibited those artists together, it became fascinating for us and for the audience. You know, what is drawing these people together? These artworks. It was a very you know, you realise that you're often exhibiting. I was exhibiting a lot with people who were interested in making work about football, but in this exhibition, these footballers, most of them, almost all of them, never had a relationship with sport and their art. So they were, you know, exploring some other aspect of the arts. They weren't tying these two things together. I'd been given the opportunity to do these shows. And it was through these opportunities that actually was the vehicle through which the projects went ahead. We did it in Portugal, we did it in Serbia, we did it in Finland, and we did it in Scotland. And it was, you know, really interesting each time how that community worked. And what would happen when you were in the training facility, you would the guys who were at the training facility thought this was you know, piss take. You're just here for having a laugh. You know, you're just here for a game of football. You know, the exhibition is just a bolt on. And then of course when we're in the gallery, when we're doing the stuff in the gallery, folk were like, you know, this is an exhibition and you're playing a wee game of football outside. You know, they really struggled, and it was a real tension, but it was really interesting where, you know, the whistle would be blown, or, I mean, it wasn't, you know, literally a whistle, but it's like, look, we've got to come out of the studio now, we've got training now, and folk are like, what? No, we've got to get this hung tonight, the show's opening tomorrow. No, our training's, you know, next 2 hours we're in training.
So it's like a trial, we had trials.
Yeah, we did, yeah. But we also had to, you know, submission of portfolio and stuff like that too. So we had to, that was being assessed at the same time. And some people were, you know, rejected because their, you know, their capacity of artists wasn't, you know, quite there. And some people we had to knock back because their, you know, the capability in the field wasn't there. So that was the nature of the project. That's just one, another way of taking it.
There is a really high wall between the two, which I think events like this and are interesting to try and break that down a wee bit, because I think it is coming down a bit in our context in the UK. You're mentioning Serbia there. An interest in football, if you are in any sort of intellectual and inverted commas pursuit in XU, is absolutely taboo. I mean, I remember going to an opening once and Sarajevo in a football shirt, and people were quite horrified.
Offended.
You know, it's like, what are you doing wearing that here, you know? And don't tell me you're actually interested. Is this a joke? You know, and it's like the 1980s here, when people interested in football then tended to keep it a bit quiet in the days of, for example, the Luton Millwall riot in '85 and Colin Moynihan and ID cards. So it was a dark time for football in England. An interest in football, if you were involved in the arts then, was kept quite quiet, you know, and the people whose involvement in football was acknowledged were either really old or already deceased. Your Albert Camus or Julio Iglesias was famously in the books of Real Madrid before he became a sort of crooner in the 70s and 80s. So these were people at the end of their careers, are no longer with us, and living people involved in both the arts and football were not so keen to admit that.
Yeah, I mean, it's to do with your art society, isn't it? In Glasgow, for example, the society that I was experienced in didn't have a fine art society as such. You know, for example, when I was at art school, as far as I was aware, there wasn't anybody living as a professional artist in the city. You know, nobody making a livelihood as an artist. There were teachers, people who were art school teachers, and many of them never exhibited either. But the idea of being an artist was like you know, it's a wee bit like being a unicorn or something. It just, you know, it seemed very, you know, it was a fairy tale. So when that wasn't a particular problem for us in relation to football, because we didn't have an art society. But in Paris and all these places, and Serbia, Belgrade, again, you know, cultures that have deep middle class and aristocratic and a fine art tradition, a European intellectual, you know, culture, and an intelligentsia, often, yes, are super snobbish about that relationship with sport. So yes, in France, people would say we're interested in taking part in this project, but we couldn't, you know, because that would be, you'd be outing somebody as having this interest. Philip Perreno, was a good footballer but wouldn't take this on because he would be embarrassed in front of the commissar.
That's an idea of embarrassment there, so I just hark back to my own practice, when I was a kid. I used to write these imaginary scores down on paper and all that, and then stick them down the side of the sofa so nobody discovered the scores, and that kind of, it's like this disclosure thing really, as well as hide something else, strangeness, and there's like a parallel there as well.
So I was just going to say, it's interesting to see how much that's changed, because I think there's some towns now in England where there is an art scene or a burgeoning art scene, particularly amongst younger artists, where actually it's a point of embarrassment if you don't support a local football club. I mean, like having been part of a studio group in Leicester around the time of like the 2016 championship, it was like if you were part of that studio complex and you weren't a fan, it was almost, wasn't as bad as all that, but I mean, off the back of that, they formed their own kind of five-a-side team called Morledge Street FC, because it was a really small cultural quarter, and this one street kind of linked 3 or 4 different kind of cultural institutions where pretty much everyone worked. So it was like, if you had a day job in any one of those, you were part of the studio group, you were in that football club, and it was. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe
there's a hell of a lot of posturing goes on in both these, in all societies, and you're an actor through all the, all the situations you find yourself. I mean, I sort of fell out with football, I suppose, when I was about, I suppose I was about 18 or something like that, and I fell out with football because everybody was reading the Daily Record or the Daily Mail or the Sun, and nobody wanted to talk about ideas, and I found that I started to fall out with it. And what reflecting upon it now, because I meet these guys now, and they're quite comfortable to talk about ideas now as 50-year-old men, and it turns out they were hiding behind their fucking newspaper, and because you couldn't be seen with a broadsheet, and you had to just talk about lassies and going drinking, and that was all the subjects that you were allowed to talk about. You weren't allowed to talk about anything else, and people were masquerading in that.
Just to pick up on that, there's a famous article in the Daily Record in '94. Do you remember we got tanked 5-0 over in Portugal? Who famously Andy Roxburgh was given the Portuguese team lineup and tactics by a taxi driver, which he took as gospel, and then set up the Scotland team, and Majula got absolutely eviscerated by Portugal. And
that was in the days when people thought, Portugal,
who are they? Yeah, we'll beat them easily. But there was a famous article after that match by, I think, Joan Burney in the Daily Record, absolutely ripping into Scottish men for caring more about football than they did about politics or society, or exactly as you're saying, ideas. And it linked into the time before the Scottish Parliament came along and Scottish self-determination. There was a theory that a lot of Scotland's latent political energy was actually visited on the national team, because that was an independent cultural expression of Scottishness at that time. And it's quite interesting that since we got our parliament and everyone has become a lot more engaged in politics in Scotland, the national team has been in free fall, and there's a lot more apathy now in Scotland about the national team than there was 25 years ago, let's say.
There's a word that kind of keeps echoing in my ears that's been brought up once. You talked about kind of the words or the ideas that are shared between, if you like, art and football. One you mentioned was that obsessiveness, really. But the other one is balance, and you've just touched upon it again. How everything becomes unbalanced. And it's that sense, sometimes when I was growing up for fans, I'd be very conscious of being in the stadium at White Hart Lane, where you would see the passion of people coming out, and at times the aggression, and you knew for a fact that on Monday morning or Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever they were at work, that wasn't there at all, and there was a complete kind of imbalance.
And I suppose it's similar for those folk who go out clubbing. You know, it's a similar Northern Soul or whatever, or go to the raves or whatever. You know, go back to the work on the Monday, and you know they're totally out there and they're fucking. But on Monday they're just an ordinary sort of office job. So it's a similar thing in the football stadium.
But in relation to, I suppose what I'm asking is in relation to art. Again, is there a connection there, or is that where something is shared, where artists are perhaps obsessive in a certain area, but for, if you like, the fan, they're obsessive only in this one area of their life. The rest of their life is not, if you like,
I don't know though, because football fan obsessiveness takes many, many forms. From being able to reel off the losing 11 of the Reserve League Cup final in 1965-66 to, you know, collecting programmes and rather than reading them, putting them immediately into a plastic sleeve. So they don't get, I've seen that a few times, it's like, what are you doing? Do you not want to read the programme? And the answer is no, they're collecting and they're kept like museum objects at home and lever
well, I suppose, I mean, we're all clearly collection. I never had a desire for a collection. I don't understand that. And again, it's to do, I suppose, about the participation. As a player, and my boys would be the same. You know, it's about playing the game. You know, we incidentally support clubs, but it's about playing the game, and it's like playing the art. It's not the collecting of the art I'm interested in.
It's about commodity value, though, isn't it? Because modern art, I suppose, at the top end, the guys who are shelling out 150 million euros for a Picasso or a Rembrandt or whatever are not buying in their living room. It goes straight into a heavily guarded facility at an airport somewhere, and it's bought purely for its commodity value and for its investment potential, which is also the same for many Premier League clubs now. The chairmen are not the old chairman of the 70s, like the famous sort of gentlemanly chairman of Derby County when Brian Clough won the league with them, you know, a scrap metal guy with a pork pie hat and a pipe or a cigar. Those guys are finished now. It's people who buy clubs at the very top, like going back to the Glazers at Manchester United, or the consortium that bought Leicester City a few years ago and helped them to secure the title a couple of seasons ago. These are the owners of football clubs now.
A bit like the Tate buying commission.
Yeah, totally. of your top cultural players like Tate Modern or MoMA as global players in the cultural market. You know, it's very similar, I think.
Yes, we've had a question from someone watching online who's asking about consumption, I suppose, in a different way, and how our attention spans are changing. And they're talking about the fact that even lasting through Match of the Day can seem a bit arduous for some viewers. Never mind, to quote them, 90 minutes plus Fergie time. And then they ask the question, is football to be appreciated in future through YouTube highlights? So what does the panel, you know, what do you think about the kind of depth of...
One of the things about, of course I'm always tangentially in relation to that, you know, just the YouTube, that was the first you know, material.
No, absolutely. It's an interesting question, and as far as commodity goes, it seems increasingly that it's very difficult to make money in both football and contemporary art. You know, a lot of it's an emotion-driven investment for love, for particular feelings of interest in one particular artist, or if you're a businessman made good and you want to transform the fortunes of your local team for a few years, you do it. But in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, both in football and in contemporary art, you're not getting your money back. Unless you're very lucky, you're not getting your money back.
The drunkest I ever got watching a football game was when I was trying to see a European fixture that Celtic were playing in, and I was in Gothenburg, and it's the only place in the world that I've ever not found the fixture being available somewhere, because usually in any Irish bar, you know, around the world, there's somebody who's able to give you an illegal feed that shows you the game. But in Gothenburg, I couldn't find it. I ran out of time, and it was a wee sailor's bar down on the docks, and I watched the game on CFAX. And it was incredible to watch a game on CFAX. I got so drunk because there was so little action. Yeah. I mean, it was like 1-0 or something. It wasn't like, there was really nothing to commend that game, but it was kind of an incredible experience.
But you touched upon something there when you were talking about YouTube again. Who wants to watch that burning Northampton, apart from someone who was at the game as a kid? And it comes back, doesn't it, again to that question of how much football is tied in with identity.
Yes, it does, and how identities have changed. I mean, thinking of, just leading on from your point, thinking of another example of a game, you can see highlights on YouTube of Hartlepool's famous win in the FA Cup over Crystal Palace with a penalty which never was given right at the end of the game. And you look at the background and it's industrial England. And it's all demolished now, it's all gone. In the same way that you watch, for example, a movie like Get Carter from 1971, and it's a Newcastle which vanished 30, 40 years ago now. And to look back and suddenly go, actually, I am quite old now. I can just about dimly remember towns looking like this as a very small person, and now it's all disappeared. So there's something about that as well, the ways in which identities, patterns of fandom, engagement has changed fundamentally.
There was an artist came to transmission. We brought him over, Eugenio Ditborn, great Chilean artist. You know, he was famous for you know, finding a really canny project to escape the Pinochet regime, where he did his paintings and he folded them up and sent them to galleries around the world. And he became sort of really a big kind of blue chip artist in the 90s, and he was everywhere. But he came to Glasgow. I was a young boy at the time, and I was kind of you know, asked to look out for him. And you know, I was so naive. I remember asking him whether it, you know, did they have you know, good seafood in Chile, and that was I had no idea that, you know, it's just 1,000 miles of coastline. So it's kind of, my idea of the world was very you know, very simple. But again, that's not that long ago. But he was utterly amazed that I'd never seen, as somebody who was passionate for football, that I'd never seen a South American game of football. And at that stage, I suppose it was about 1990, there was no way you could see a South American game of football. So it was like, you know, you'd heard about it, you knew it was there, but it wasn't available. And I suppose now, you know, the availability of seeing, you know, games, if you're interested in seeing other styles of football or whatever, it's there to be. That is one of the uses of you know, streaming and you know, channels that show you know, games that are, you know, not the regular games.
This leads me on to another project which relates to art. There's a project called The Other Final. Have you seen it?
Aye.
It's by a Dutch advertising guy, I can't remember his name. And on the same day as the World Cup final in South Korea in 2002, he arranged for a game to be played between the two worst sides in international football.
The lowest ranking.
The lowest ranked. So it was Bhutan against Montserrat, and Montserrat's squad are all based in England, and they play for clubs like Corby, Romulus, Lowestoft, you know, they're non-league players. And the aim was to show the other side of football that people never, exactly what you were saying, people never get to see. Who on earth would think to watch a game like that? And it's a beautiful film, actually. The game was played in Bhutan in a remarkable stadium. There's a huge crowd, and Bhutan won 4-0. But the whole point was not to win, that both sides shared the trophy at the end. Bhutan were the home team, yeah. Yeah. Montserrat don't travel well. Yeah.
We've been asked another question by our online audience. and I'll just read it directly. Does making football safe to attend make it boring to consume?
Yeah, I think we're quite, divided on that.
Both sides then?
I can see where the question's coming from. I do understand it. But anyone who was watching football during the Bradford Stadium disaster, the Highsole disaster, Hillsborough, it goes back to the point about balance, and that's where the safe standing movement is coming from now. You don't want to completely kill the atmosphere in football, but equally you don't want people shoehorned into death trap stadia,
There's lots of sanitising going on at Celtic. They don't play, songs that have been sang in the stadium for 100 years, because they're regarded as contentious songs. So there's now, a list of songs that can be sang and all that kind of crap. People, the Green Brigade were expelled from the stadium for, having flares, and so there is always a tension there, and it's and what is, I suppose, interesting is seeing how people play with that tension. I remember going to, for example, last year, and you see it on YouTube. I've seen it on YouTube. Folk complaining, Liverpool supporters complaining about. That school groups from Glasgow come down and they're sitting next to them in the stadium. You've got like 150 kind of Glasgow school kids that have no interest in this team, and how's that meant to work? That's just been a corporate block that's been bought, and it's just sent out there. Certain clubs suffer from that.
And this is partly. I know you're very interested in Rangers and Celtic and great institutions in Scotland.
You're not saying that because you're on camera.
Of course, and that will remain between us, of course. My lawyer vigorously denies Mr. Buchanan's allegations. But no, what I was going to say was that the corporatisation of football at the top level has driven a bit of a resurgence of interest in the smaller clubs, which I watch, as you know, I watch a lot more of in Scotland. But again, it relates to this sort of against modern football sort of hashtag, and it can be, I agree with you, it can be a wee bit worthy and pious and self-congratulatory. But I do think that, on the other hand, like the local example, that's exactly, I'm all of the above. But I do think there are great achievements from this renewed interest in football at the lower levels, like supporters banding together to reform a club and then push it up the leagues quickly, as Wimbledon being the most famous example, Accrington Stanley as well, although that was a more traditional chairman-led model to get them through non-leagues and back into the league. But small number of supporters there have a huge part to play, and I think that's really an important part of the story as well to think about.
Can I say, just as a fact, probably for geographical reasons, I've got no particular major side to support, I don't. And your point about falling out of football, I'm beginning to do that because of the hype that goes with the Premiership. Yeah. The hype and the pundits.
Yeah.
If I'm going to watch a football match, I don't need them to tell me what's happening. I wouldn't be watching it if I wasn't interested and I didn't know. That sort of stuff. Get back to just playing the game. Show the game. Don't want all this flash stuff.
Analysis and all that.
They disagree. So one of them must be wrong. There's no point in being there. So just let's show the game. We'll enjoy it.
I saw a wee bit of TV footage, which it was fascinating for me. I had never thought about it, but it was an ex-professional footballer. I can't remember exactly who it was now, but he was watching the game in the house and he had the volume off. He was reading the game like that.
That's a really good way to watch the game, actually. Off, Chris Kamara et al. By, mute. And it's true in the radio too. If you listen to someone like Alan Green and Radio 5, he's just a commentator, but the guy presents himself as some major sort of colossus of the game.
Des Lynam of the...
I mean, and you listen to him commentating something like West Brom against Stoke, and okay, it might be a bit of a slow game, but you listen to him and it's like someone's asked him to reset his O-level chemistry. You know, he sounds so miserable and fed up. You're being paid a huge amount of coin to watch a game that most people have paid 60 quid to get into. You know, go away. So I agree with you.
And I've noticed that when I've been down here watching, because of course this is interesting for me as a side element, this notion that there's one TV dedicated to Scottish football and one to the Premiership, and it's going on simultaneously. And I have been quite fascinated, not ever watching English football, because I've not got enough hours of my life to watch my own league and another league. So what I've been very conscious of, because of course you're reading about it in the newspapers and all that, it is about the delivery system, and as an artist who's used film and all that, I mean, it's you're talking, I don't know how many cameras a Premiership game is getting, but it's definitely 10 cameras easy. And you know, it was funny because last weekend it was Ross County, Rangers Ross County. I mean, venerable clubs with this, you know, as big a history as Manchester United or any of these clubs, but they had, two cameras like that, and it was just to do with a financial kind of input and the seduction, of course, of the replays of the. I recognise now that that's what Joe Hart is there for. He's like the pantomime baddie. He's just like, he's got to do the theatrical save. I suspect now you're being profiled for that as well. And, you know, there is an expectation that you have to have two theatrical saves a game, or you're not made your quota. And I would say that is another way of reading the game. You know.
Yeah. Just talking about photographs and the number of cameras around the ground. I'm going to pass around a couple of pictures. One is of Douglas and Philippe Paradot's film about Zidane. I think that was 28 cameras they had around the stadium for that game, which just took a La Liga fixture. I think they get Real Madrid against Oviedo, I think, and Zidane actually gets sent off at the end, but he is the focus of the video, and just how much he gives and what Douglas's old methodology, seeing things that you're not meant to see in film. It's an incredible piece. And then Old School, this is one of the most famous photographs in football history, from the Matthews final of 1953. Stanley Matthews of Blackpool taking on Malcolm Barras of Bolton Wanderers, and it's a beautiful balletic photograph, it's a press photograph, but full of incredible aesthetic qualities. You know, it's a timeless image.
I used to work for the Sunday Post, and I used to stick the football in the shot, because often the shot was taken and the football wasn't in it. But in order to get the shot, it was like that ball would be over there. They would have a wee box of balls, and they would ask me to put where I thought the ball should be in that.
So that's where Spot the Ball came from, was it?
Yes.
Yes.
One thing that has surprised me with regard to allegiances and art and football is most people here know we did a project recently with the Northampton Town Football Club, and when I was emailing a lot of people who I know in the art world, who I know are interested in football, quite a few came back to me and said, well, it's not my team, so I'm not really interested. So their allegiance was first to their club, and because we weren't working with their club, they weren't interested to come and see the
That's
performance.
interesting. Yeah.
So I just thought that was fascinating, where your allegiances are and what gets priority.
I think if I was asked to Man United, I'd be struggling. I think if it was Manchester United, something like that, and someone gave me an opportunity to do it like that, being a Liverpool supporter, I'd really, really struggle. So, if there is that, there's always going to be that, it's Liverpool or...
I mean, it's funny how people... I was on holiday in Crete, and there was a couple living next door, and I'd got a wee bit bored with the resort, and I went up the back of the town, and there was like the most basic football, but they had a wee poster saying the game was on tomorrow night, and I thought I'd got to know the guy quite well, and I said, we're struggling for things to do. There wasn't very much going on in this wee resort. We'd sort of explored the whole thing by this stage. And I said, why don't we go up tomorrow night and have a wee look at the football? And when I took him up, he thought I'd totally missold him this undertaking. He had an image of it being, like the San Siro or something like that. Yeah. And he hadn't quite worked out in his mind that the resort was here. It was only going to be something like that. But he was totally offended with me and like, what the fuck are you bringing me here for?
But this thing that you're talking about, and you've mentioned as well, is a very UK thing. In Europe, I think there's far less of a sort of passionate identification with one team to the exclusion of others. Of course, there is that, but for example, in XU, a lot of experience in top division games of tiny crowds. People do not watch the local product because they're watching the Premier League, which has been franchised with a local broadcaster who paid a lot of money for it. So, for example, in Macedonia, where I was this summer, games involving Vardar, Skopje, Rabat and HK, the two biggest teams in the capital, will get 2,000-3,000, 4,000, which is a National League, lower League 2 attendance in England and a Championship attendance in Scotland. There just isn't that, and people will go to watch whoever is doing well. So if one of these teams is in Europe, they'll get a huge crowd at the National Stadium because they're the Macedonian representative playing, I don't know, Galatasaray or someone like that, a big European side, and everyone will come out to watch the game and support. So there isn't quite this exclusiveness that your friends had in response to the project at Northampton,
Surprised me.
I mean, you're absolutely right. People are always shocked that I have no interest in English football, and that, particularly when I'm abroad, it's like, I don't have enough hours in my life. But you know what I mean? It's funny how some people are great generalists, other people are great have a very particular. I watch the game in a very particular fashion. I have the things that I enjoy. I invest my time in that, but I'm looking at the guy sitting next to me is watching an entirely different game, looking at different things.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why you talked earlier about actually art and football aren't kind of bedfellows? And I think I've heard you talk before about Venn diagrams, and art is over here and football's over here, and never the twain really come together. And do you think it's partly because the knowledge that you need in terms of the appreciation of football is not necessary. Well, it's not there in the art world, and therefore it's kind of like, well, that's why those two Venn diagrams can't meet, because actually the appreciation is to appreciate that you have to have
a lot of that comes from our educational system, and you find it's very different in North America. The best schools in Boston, I get invited to do some work in Phillips Academy, and that idea, they were still running basically a classical education where it was healthy body, healthy mind. Had to be, the ideal pupil was the one who was fit, athletic, was the captain, but was also getting the good grades. That's what they saw as their ideal output, and which is a very kind of classical model, as in classical Roman, I suppose. Whereas in Britain, the folk are separated at a very, very early age. If you show any capacity as somebody who is, perhaps clever, you're taken out of the art room, and you're given academic subjects, and you're also taken out of the sports hall, including the fact that you get notes from your parents, because that's you're not going to get a job as a footballer, so why does my boy have to do that? So there's a sort of negativity and these communities. So the art community and the football community have not been hanging about with each other, since they were, at nursery school, basically. Because as soon as you're into primary, they're separated and they don't get to, and if you have those dual interests, you're kind of hiding them, aren't you? You're a wee bit in the closet about that, and you have these two separate worlds, but they're not really linked.
Do you reckon it's also something to do with the fact that both those two once you get to a certain point, it's quite difficult to get into them at a later stage in your life? It takes a bit of a background and an interest from an early age to kind of build that up. You don't see many people who are kind of like, born again football supporters who've like never followed a team until they're sort of fully grown adults, and then suddenly discover it all of a sudden. It's not, there's always seems to be they've followed it since then.
I don't know whether the hipster movement has an interest in football, does it? I think it does. So I guess that's an appendage. You've got your track bike and you've got your football club. You didn't have it last year, but if you're going to be a hipster, you better get it. So
Clapton, the non-league club in London, is the major hipster club. Yeah.
So what are they called?
Clapton FC. They're of course, I'm sure they're old fans who've been watching them for a long time would be horrified to be called hipsters, but there is that sort of affiliation. That's what I'm told.
Yeah, sports can be get overrun. I remember in New York thinking, in preparation to go into New York, I wanted to see basketball. I thought this would be a fantastic experience. I really felt I was going to connect with this sport, and I went along to the Madison Square Garden, and my tickets that I could afford were so far back that I could almost not see what was going on down there. But also, I was entirely surrounded by people on first dates who were not there for the game. They were all trying to get after each other, and that's all they were interested in. So there was no atmosphere, and that's how that was being used. And so different sports get taken up for different reasons by different communities. Different teams get borrowed, get taken. Clubs get wrestled away. Whether it's an ultra group or whatever, they can start to steal an identity of a club or draw too much attention to it, or the politics of that other supporters are not keen on. And so you're always fighting for who has control of your club. Even amongst the fans. I know that Paris Saint-Germain, when I was growing up, it was famous that they had police barricade between the neo-Nazis and the left-wing supporters, that they had to be escorted out of the stadium separately, the same fan base. So that can happen. You can it's kind of nuts. So
Are there any more questions?
From the floor?
From the floor, because I'm conscious that I've been asking a lot of personal questions, and I've got a couple more, so I just wanted to just to make sure. Okay, one of the questions I've got actually comes back to the online question about YouTube and kind of whether we're going to just get the highlights in relation to our concentration. And the question for me is kind of like, do you feel that actually now that element of concentration and obsessiveness that potentially we're led to believe you need in art is actually going to mean, to a certain extent, that football now is at its zenith, and actually it's going to... It's really strange.
You've been predicting that for years, have you?
Well, no, I haven't. What really shocked me was I was in London for the World Athletics, and I met up with a guy I knew at a wedding, and he has been a Man United season ticket holder for decades, and he told me they have to apply for away games. Even if you don't go, you have to apply, because if you miss an application for an away game, you go down.
Right.
You go down the list. And I was like, good grief. And he was saying he thinks now, he says when he goes, because he doesn't go, even though he's a season ticket holder, he doesn't go to every game. And sometimes when he goes, he says there's empty seats around him now, from the people who he'd always see and always go. When he tries to sell his seat now for face value on the days where he doesn't want to go, he can't get rid of it. And he says and it's him and his wife who are both season tickets holders. It's how they met. They're both contemplating giving up their season ticket holders now. And for me, it's kind of like, well, I'd never ever be a season ticket holder, because I suppose growing up watching Spurs, you knew that there were games you just didn't want to be in there. It's when I hear people like that saying that it's coming. So do you think it's that element of perhaps, again, football is a generational thing, and it's kind of reached its zenith now?
Well, there is definitely. You can see that there's a gentrification of the support of the game, and there is a status associated with having those tickets and all that, and people see it as being a supporter to own those tickets but not actually go to the game. So there is a lot of that going on. I don't know what is in store for football. It comes up every year myself about how should we keep the season tickets going? They're expensive. Can we really afford that? I used to love the idea of going to games when I wanted to. I'm going to go to the game, but you can't do that anymore. I guess you can do it in small clubs, and they're always welcoming. But one of the sorry again to move into a tangential relationship to smaller clubs. One of the things that I find problematic at smaller clubs is the nastiness is very audible. I struggle with how nasty small club supporters are, and how I'm expected to bloody be in their company. Whereas when I'm in my big club with 50,000 or whatever, I don't know whether it's because there's a general roar. I don't hear that individual person being nasty over there. Whereas, at a smaller club like at Corby, I could hear that arsehole across there for the whole bloody game, saying such stupid things. Whereas, I don't get that in my stadium experience. So it's funny because, of course, Rangers and Celtic would be criticised as being, a lot of aggression, a lot of sort of nastiness, but the nastiest game I ever went to was the one in Arbroath, and I had my boys there, and again, a lot of people wouldn't take their boys to see Rangers and Celtic because they feel the clubs stand for a level of aggression and a level of violence, and it has that reputation as being perhaps a wee bit risky to take children into that environment. But at bloody Arbroath, the abuse between men, all abusing, the goalkeeper, I couldn't avoid it. There was nowhere I could stand where I wasn't getting it. And my boys were looking at these guys, like, what is going on here? Why are they, doing that? They couldn't understand that. And I found it difficult to explain to them. It was like, let's go back to our club, mate. It's like...
Yeah, I mean, leaving that aside, going back to the season ticket point that you were making, there's been a lot of criticism online recently of Manchester City because it's come to people's attention that Manchester City have a season ticket for £18,500, and for that you get put in what looks like a VIP airport lounge next to the Players' Tunnel, which has a glass wall, and you pay for access to this, so you get to see the players warming up and going onto the park, and then you get to go get a lift upstairs to your executive seats to watch the game, and then down again to watch them come in afterwards. And it's like, who on earth is paying that money to sit in an airport lounge at the City of Manchester Stadium watching players earning £100,000 a week ignore them, before kick-off? And it's only going to be a matter of time before one of those players comes off disappointed after a home defeat and tells one of the expensive season ticket holders to do something unpleasant to themselves, So
something I quite like about that, though. So some of that image, like that sort of sanitized.
There was this photograph.
I quite like that. I'm just quite interested myself in sort of non-places and all those sort of like airports and transitional zones. But there's something I quite like about the idea of having that sort of distance. And I suppose again, me having my sort of having an imaginary sort of imaginary, they sort of imagine these almost faceless footballers and that sort of, there's something quite, I don't know, I quite like about that.
Yeah, I've always had the idea that it would be great to sell the opportunity to, you know, at the centre circle, you know, that it's a bit like a manhole and that you pay for the privilege to, you know, be able to stick your head up, you know, like that, you know, like from underneath, you know. If you've got a really expensive ticket, you walk down there and down again.
Well, actually, that touches upon the issue that we've not used perhaps we have used the word, which is access. You know, and you both were saying about earlier on in the discussion about how, if you like, working class are being squeezed out of certain areas.
Aye, contemporary art.
Yeah, well, I was just I was actually just going to say in terms of art and football, and in terms of where do you feel, say for contemporary art, particularly now in education, and you mentioned that whole element of like, or you know, show any ability intellectually and you're removed in the primary school and set on that train. So how do you feel as an artist and yourself, you know, as an artist and academic as well, in terms of where the balance, to use another word from this evening's discussion, should be in relation to access for young people?
Yeah, I mean, that is you know, a deeply structural you know, question, and I used to, you know, we all used to think that you know, that history was linear and that was you know, my experience at art school was going to be you know, followed by the next generation's experience of art school. But I realise now, I realised a long time ago now, that I was in this bubble, this post-war bubble, where I was the last fully grant-maintained intake at Glasgow School of Art, and you know, the year after I came in, you were expected to pay, you had a loan, and so that's now been going, so that's 85, the year after I came into art school, that it started to be the case that people were having to pay, and so of course that became less and less appealing as a prospect to go into this industry that you know, has a very uncertain economic you know, outcome at the end. So it's when I go into art school now, and I only go in you know, periodically, and I suppose I have a relationship with Glasgow School of Art, but they have changed dramatically how they deliver. You know, it's a bit like the football. They are delivering a product. It's the product. You know, there isn't so much of a. It doesn't feel as if there's. You know, it's very bureaucratic. It's very management led. It's you know, it's not as experimental. There's not as much time to be experimental. And I suppose that's you know, similar in. You know, you probably can parallel that with the world of football, where people are applying you know, business plans and you know, statistics in order to create potentially an economically valuable product, and you know, personnel and all the kind of training of footballers, and all that is structurally problematic. So I think you know, across that is something that both those communities absolutely share, and I think there's less and less working class boys involved in football, and there's less and less working class children involved in art.
I'm lucky to work at a place where there is still quite a significant working class demographic in our undergraduate intake. But at the bigger, without mentioning names, at the bigger institutions in the UK, just like the art institutions, just like the biggest football clubs at the top of the tree in the Premier League, they're players in a global market, and they don't have to be too concerned about the local market anymore. The parallel to the art school experience that Roddy's mentioning is, you know, if the art school is Real Madrid, your Ronaldos and Gareth Bales would not be playing, they'd be out promoting the brand in the Far East, for example, whereas the actual players in the team would be the reserve team players who are brought in because they're good enough to beat most sides anyway, you know, and to compete in that, which they do that often.
Product placement, they do go out to China every year, every winter, or every summer.
In terms of class, also, I think it's important to extend it to the idea of earnings. And people think of footballers and go, oh, footballers are paid so much money for doing very little. Actually, that's a tiny, tiny sliver of the football market, the telephone directory salaries that a Ronaldo or a Neymar or a Gareth Bale are paid for playing at the world's biggest clubs has nothing to do with the guy playing for Northampton Town or playing non-league, even who's paid.
Yeah. Vouch for that.
Who's probably and most artists. Well, that was just what I was going on to say. I think the last Arts Council survey said that there's some extraordinary percentage, I can't remember the exact percentage, of artists earn under £10,000 a year. You know, whereas you do have, okay, but everyone reads about Damien Hirst selling his diamond-crusted skull for 50 million and thinks, oh, well, all artists are like that. So, yeah. So there is an interesting structural parallel there, I think, in terms of relationship to class. And you and I were talking earlier about this Radio 4 documentary that I'm sure you all heard was on a couple of years ago, where the presenter was lamenting that basically since the introduction of tuition fees in England and Wales, the working classes had been squeezed out of art school provision almost altogether, and the big art school players now are, in his rather pessimistic view, little more than finishing schools for the well-to-do. You know, and he was really lamenting the fact that the working class contribution to contemporary art, and from what you're describing as the post-war bubble, I suppose, from the ex-servicemen's grants onwards, you know, in the late 40s through to the late 70s, early 80s. That's a historical memory now, sadly. And who knows, it's too early to say what the consequences will be in the long term, whether there will be this entrepreneurialism which will pull everyone out the mire, or whether, you know, working class children will simply stop considering art as a career that they want to be interested in. I don't think it'll ever stop with football or boxing, simply because of the powerful nature of the narrative that this is a way to get yourself out and your family out of dire poverty. Even someone like Rooney, you know, is from that background.
Boxing, I think, is in massive decline, you know, in the UK. You know, when you're in Mexico, you see it's still, you know, very... again, different trades at different points are in and out of fashion. It would have been very fashionable in the 30s and 40s to be a boxer in Glasgow. It's much more minority now. There are other ways to make a living. You know, in India, I remember seeing that it was that folk were... that to be in the army was like regarded as like quite an honourable thing to do, and in the UK to join the army, you know, seems often a total, you know, gasp of desperation, you know, and it's not particularly well respected. It's, you know, people see it that it's an easier way to make a living than joining the army. I guess teachers are another set of folk who have been absolutely sort of had their status totally undermined. And people, you know, are not so keen on that. They think there must be an easier way to make a living. It used to be a high status position in a community, and that is often, you know, not the case anymore. That's not the way that people think of one another. They think of people, you know, they feel sorry for teachers and stuff like that, rather than, oh my God, he is an educated man or woman or whatever. So, and football, I suppose, is dealing with, again, in different communities, I suppose you would have different understanding of what are the potential, the possibilities. Nuno Sacramento says that in Portugal, when he was growing up, there wasn't a class, you know, difference, that it was open to a wider community of individuals. But in the youth football I go to, is a very specific group of people who are taking part in football. And as I say, a lot of the people who don't have cars, don't have, you know, it's sort of, it's taxi drivers to tradesmen is pretty much your band of people who are involved in football. Nobody below that level is involved in football. Nobody, you know, in a higher paying job And you see them coming along and being frozen out, and people not knowing what to do with them when they turn up, because they have different values. And I remember one of the boys, it was the minister's son, it turned out to be a good footballer, and he lasted a couple of years and he was great, but he disappeared because he couldn't find a place in there. His family couldn't find a place in there. They thought the boy was an asset, so they tried to keep him and work with him, but he felt so different from those, and he felt his family were so different that he kind of fell out of it. So I suppose at art school, I think I've seen this again directly, where I've seen working class students, and I suppose I'm probably the one that brought that to the table, but of course that term I think is absolutely redundant now anyway. So that's a term from the 50s or something. So I don't know what you would how you categorise people these days. I'm sure there are all sorts of correct language how to how to describe that, but you often see people from I've seen people who find it difficult to operate in the classroom because they're not from a privileged background, and those in the class are, who know how to talk confidently. It's expected of you at art school more and more. This idea of being good at drawing is no longer what takes you to art school. Talking about, having a good talk about things is regarded very highly now, and a student who can draw a horse is not really of any value to anybody anymore. So, I mean, that was what took me to art school. I was good at drawing horses. But it wouldn't count now.
It's interesting. I do think working class is still very relevant. Yes, it's not the 1950s working class anymore, but I do think the group of people who work precariously or for minimum wage, there isn't the trades that held them together as communities, as we were discussing early on this evening, be it steel here or coal in Ayrshire or Lanarkshire or Fife. But I do think that class still very much exists, and that's why we have the strange pattern of a sort of gentrification of the game, which has been ongoing since probably the early 90s. Everyone blames Nick Hornby, but I think it's unfair to blame just one novelist. But I think there was no doubt a whole sense, it's to do with Sky as well. And where do you see football now if you've no money for a Sky subscription or an internet connection? Would you actually go and watch it? Maybe sneak into the pub, but then why would you do that when there's other possibilities for you to do it, Or where would it's also to do with the ownership of common space too, and the quiet and stealthy privatisation of formerly common land, where people could go and enjoy a kickabout and not be chased away. Well, sorry, but all that former common land is now really being privatised, particularly in the big cities, at rated knots. And new developments that are being built are built in sort of, this is private land, stay off. So it's about ownership of common space as well, because common space is one of the very basic fundamentals of football. It's a very simple game. All you need is a ball, doesn't even have to be in very good shape, and a bit of ground. But if that ground's disappearing, then,
We used to have the street, but you can't play in the
street anymore. Yeah.
Okay, and on that note, we've been in a very commonplace tonight, and for our online viewers, it's worth pointing out now that the silence has descended that we've been at the Irish Centre and we've been sharing the space with some Irish dance classes. So we've been accompanied by some very upbeat music. If perhaps some of the conversation at times has been a bit pessimistic in terms of the outlook for contemporary art, football, and working class, but it just remains for me to thank you all for coming this evening. Thanks to Martin for filming. Thanks to the Corby Irish Centre for hosting Firmin Woods on tour and for providing the very upbeat music. The next Firmin Woods talk will be Art and Memory in November. We're all off to watch the second half of Ireland against Serbia now, so thanks very much.
Don't tell us the score.
So thanks very much, Andy.
Thanks to
Thank you.
Robbie, and
Cheers, guys.
thanks very much.
Hands across the ocean, eh?
Thanks very much.
Thanks for going around the table there. Thanks for coming along there. Cheers, guys. Thanks.